Hi, thank you, Zarina. Hi, everybody. It's odd now to have my camera on for the first time. I assume everybody can hear me okay and see me. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the final session of the day. We have a panel discussion that's entitled Decolonizing Climate Education. So my name's Callum McGregor, and I'll be hosting the panel discussion alongside my colleague Radhika Govinda. So we're both part of the organising team. I'm a lecturer in education at Edinburgh University, and I'm particularly interested in the connections between education and collective action on climate change, as well as the relationship between social justice and climate action too. So Radhika is a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Edinburgh, and her work bridges the fields of sociology of gender, international development, and South Asian studies. And one of Radhika's primary interests is in decolonising knowledge production, not only in international development discourses, but also, importantly, in our higher education institutions. And to this end, Radhika has an enduring interest in and a commitment to decolonial pedagogies. So, as you're all aware, the overarching purpose of the series of events is to make space for a sustained dialogue on why it's important and what it actually means to centre social justice in climate change education action. And so, to me, these are partly questions about who knowledge counts, and indeed what counts as knowledge in education. And I think that's been a feature of today. And so in asking these questions, it directs our attention to historically rooted and racially inflected practices that habitually promote the knowledge of colonising cultures as quote unquote universal knowledge about climate change. And so to this end, Radhika and I invited a panel to speak to two different questions. So one was how and why might we use decolonial and anti-racist approaches and perspectives to educate about climate justice? And then the second question was what are some of the challenges and also some of the rewards of doing this work? So we're going to hear from our four different speakers who will consider these questions from diverse perspectives and standpoints, and they'll all speak to different educational contexts too. So without further ado, I just want to introduce our panelists before handing over to them for the next half an hour or so. So what I'm going to do is introduce everybody in the order that they're going to speak. So firstly, Deborah McGregor is Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice at York University in Toronto, Canada. So Professor McGregor is Anishinaabe from Whitefish River First Nation, Birch Island in Ontario. And so Professor McGregor's research is focused on Indigenous knowledge systems and their various applications in diverse contexts, including environmental and water governance, environmental justice, health environment, climate change, and Indigenous legal traditions. So Professor McGregor remains actively involved in a variety of Indigenous communities, serving as an advisor and continuing to engage in community-based research and activities. So Professor McGregor has been at the forefront of Indigenous environmental justice and Indigenous research theory and practice. And so Professor McGregor is, I think, going to focus on colonialism, amongst other things, why it matters climate change education in the context of Indigenous peoples in Canada. So that will be our first speaker. So our second speaker is Fope Olaleye. And Fope is Fope is a Newcastle University politics graduate and was elected the Black Students Officer for the National Union of Students from 2019-20, where they represented all African, Asian, Arab and Caribbean students and those in the diaspora in further and higher education. So Fope is a key figure and activist in championing decolonization work, climate justice and national guidance on racial harassment. They're currently a facilitator who works with global organizations to design inclusive workplaces, and their writing has been featured in The Guardian, Galdem, the BBC, amongst others. So Fope will address, amongst other things, how we can understand climate injustice to be racialized and gendered. So our next speaker after that will be Jolly Oluka. Jolly has worked with SCOREscotland Green Futures project, and we've heard about her work today earlier in the community conversation. And Jolly's worked as the development officer since the Green Futures project's inception in 2013. Previously, Jolly worked as a research assistant with Uganda Population Secretariat and as a rural development project manager and monitoring and evaluation officer. Jolly holds an MPhil degree in demography from Cairo Demographic Centre and a BSc in population studies. Jolly has a deep passion, great skills and experience in community development, as we've seen today, and is very passionate about climate change and particularly its impact on food security. And her experience of working on climate change has increased her passion and compelled her to change her own behaviour in order to protect the environment. But besides doing her bit, Jolly encourages and supports others to take individual action, but where possible, act collectively to save our planet for a better tomorrow. So Jolly will address the question of why decolonisation of education should be centred around empowering those who have been or will be most affected by the climate crisis. And Jolly will also touch on her own community work, ensuring that community members are empowered to take action in their own capacity by making it easy to understand and engaging. And then last but not least is our final panelist, Callum Mcclellan. And Callum is a science teacher who's also taught, is a science teacher who's taught in the Borders, Àrd-sgoil, Butte and Edinburgh, and was head of science at Trinity Academy for a number of years. So Callum recently converted to teaching science through the medium of Gaelic in the past few months and has been heavily involved in a climate change project, bringing together young people and politicians. So in this context, Callum's going to speak to how teachers can help young people to explore the numbers behind climate injustice, using data to practice numeracy skills, but also importantly, linking that to their judgment of what's right and wrong. So that might involve, for example, using data to understand links between climate change, immigration, refugee movement. So we're going to hear from each panelist for about between 5 and 7 minutes, which sounds like a very specific time. So then I'll hopefully leave us with around 20 minutes for questions. And then Radhika is going to field questions. And as we've done so far, you can all pose questions by posting them in the chat space. So I don't think there's anything else for me to say. So I'd just like to pass over to our first panelist, Deborah.
Thank you for that introduction. And I was saying it's not very often I'm actually moderated by another McGregor. So, and I do have ancestors in Scotland. So can everybody hear me? Just thumbs up if, okay, good. Yeah, so good morning, afternoon, and I will try to be 5 minutes. As an academic, we're used to talking for like 2 to 3 hours at a time. But I was really inspired by Mara's presentation. And actually, when I generally, like even in the world that I operate in, academic work world, policy world, I actually talk about climate change stories and say that Indigenous peoples have we have our own stories about how we understand what's happening. And a lot of my work has tried to bring those into the fore. But what I'll do in hopefully 5 minutes is talk about sort of what I draw into these conversations in terms of anti-racist climate change education, decolonizing education in the Canadian context, which I know the best. That is when I talk about this and when I'm teaching, I always draw in how Indigenous peoples have been treated historically, but continue to be treated. So this is important. People think that's all in the past. It's not happening anymore, but it is at every scale up to the global level. And we've had recent commissions that point to this, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Murdered, Missing, and Indigenous Women and Girls. So gender is a huge factor in this and how women and gender fluid peoples and non-binary non-binary peoples might be influenced as well. And then the question is like, what does that have to do with our topic? What does that have to do with climate change? It has everything to do with it because it's the context, it's the everyday reality of people who are the most impacted by climate change, but contributed, not really contributed to the problem. So to me, being able to tell our own stories on our own terms is really important. And in the Inupiaq tradition, when I do workshops with youth, is we talk about what some of our own stories are and how we've had to face similar challenges and what sort of strengths we had to rely on to do it. So that would be our own culture and our own language and our own land-based activities. That's what enabled us to survive. That's what's actually going to build our resilience into the future. So these stories are like really important actually for survival. And actually, as Callum pointed out, they're actually sources of knowledge. One thing that I'm working on in Canada is the Indigenous Resilience Report, because all these assessments are done by IPCC. They're very scientifically driven. Now they're trying to include traditional knowledge. They don't have a clue. They don't have a clue how to do it, unfortunately, in my view. So, and that's what our big challenge was. What are the sources that we're going to rely on for this? What are the sources of knowledge that are important to Indigenous people that'll speak to our experience and how we want to face the future? So a lot of my research right now is what does our self-determined future look like in face of what we're challenged with, and what kind of knowledges do we need to rely on that? So stories are really important. And it's just coming on what Mara said, let alone what other things I wanted to talk about. But because I don't want to take up space for others, and this panel is super amazing, so thank you for bringing them together. So I really want to hear what they have to say. One of the other challenges that I have in anti-racism, anti-colonial education in relation to climate justice, actually, is that people in a lot of the circles I'm in don't like to say that. They like to just say climate change. They don't like to say justice. They don't like to say climate crisis, even though Indigenous communities in Canada have declared climate crisis in their communities for water and food insecurity and all kinds of multiple crises that they're facing. They don't want to go there. They don't want to talk about that. So really trying to bring in the equity and justice lens into the conversations is really important. And it's hard to do it. Even with people who you think should get it, they don't. And also talking about how other people's solutions can actually exacerbate existing inequities. I'll just quickly give an example of that. Again, I'm in these policy circles. I'm part of the Institute on Climate Choices, called upon by governments to come and talk about these topics. And the solution is everyone should have an electric car and we'll be fine. And I'm like, well, that doesn't really work in a northern fly-in community where there aren't roads. You can't even get there in parts of northern Canada, a lot of Ontario and the province that I live in. And also, it actually, where does that electricity come from? A lot of it is hydroelectric development. And that impacts Indigenous peoples in very different ways than people in urban centers who would get to enjoy a nice electric car, so sometimes other people's solutions actually cause more problems in communities that are marginalized and experience inequities. So I'm finding a big challenge for me is just introducing other language. Like people don't, like they're happy to talk about carbon, they'll talk about climate change. I call those the big C words, but they don't want to talk about colonialism and how it matters in these conversations. I'm going to stop there because, again, I was really trying to keep track of my time. I think I kept within 5 minutes. I hope so, which is an achievement for an academic. And really looking forward to hearing from others and looking forward to the chat. I know this is a very active chat, which is great. And hear what kind of questions and comments and contributions that others want to make. So thank you for listening to that brain dump and that spiel, and looking forward to the rest of it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. And thank you for being so mindful of the time. I think you probably had a little more time if you wanted to use it. I think the next person that we're going to invite to speak is Fope.
Can everyone hear me? Thumbs up. Oh, fantastic. Sorry, sometimes Zoom just hates me. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you so much to Deborah for speaking before me. You picked on a lot of things that I wanted to talk about, which is fantastic because I can jump off the point you were going to make. When I was thinking about how I wanted to do a spiel for 5 minutes. I wanted to find a way to connect quite a lot of the work I do with decolonization with also climate justice, because in a lot of the circles I run, it's either or. There doesn't seem to be this understanding that it's all tied up. And something that Deborah said that really made it easier for me to, oh, this is how I can do it, is this idea of language and how do we frame things? How do we frame where we're going? And yes, what Marcus just said in the chat, it's really important. And so I do quite a lot of work in decolonization, specifically in like a higher education context, just explaining what does it mean and giving students the context and the historical background to understand what decolonization is, so they can take the tools and take it back to their university and do amazing work. And so one of the starting points I always use is like language. And Callum asked the question, like, who owns knowledge? And that's the title of one of the workshops I do, of like, who can own knowledge and what is counted as knowledge? What is seen as like rigorous academic studies and what's seen as stories passed down tribe? How is one seen as more valid and one seen as more as not? And that framing of language, I think, is really important when we talk about climate justice. Even like the framing of what we call it, climate change, global warming, that is like specific political mechanisms so that we don't see the inherent violence in it. And even like just using words like climate justice, or what I tend to use as climate injustice, we can begin to ask the questions of what's been obscured here and why is it being obscured? And I think that's really important. So I said I was going to talk a little bit how like the racialized and gendered nature of climate injustice, which I don't know if I'm still going to do, because literally an hour ago I was like, what if I talk about this? So we'll see where I'm going to go with it. I think it's really interesting that when we talk about climate injustice or climate change or anything in the UK, it's always evolved from this understanding of what is poverty and what is austerity and who are the people who are going to be at the forefront of these disasters, and more importantly, who are already facing the repercussions of what we've done to the world 500 years ago. And I think it's really country
Fope, I think we've lost you.
Maybe send the chat message.
Do you want to bring in one of the other speakers just now then? And then we can come back to Fope when we get her back.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, Zarina. Okay, yeah, that'll give Fope a little bit of time to come back in. That seems fair. So, Jolly, would you be prepared then to come in now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Calum. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for giving us an opportunity for SCOREscotland to facilitate the morning conversation. I would like to just introduce a little bit about SCOREscotland for those who missed the morning session. So SCOREscotland is an organization that is based in Edinburgh and serves most Black and minority ethnic communities living in West and Southwest Edinburgh. But we are an inclusive organization and everyone is welcome to become a member. SCOREscotland's mission and purpose for existence is to work in partnership with others to address the causes and effects of racism and to promote race equality. We work to break down barriers to the full participation of minority ethnic communities in all aspects of civic life. And you may be wondering, this is a race equality organization. How does climate change fit in? Our climate change work came into existence when we were made aware that ethnic minorities are hard to reach in courts and they are not interested in climate change. I've read statements like innovative ways of engaging with Black and minority ethnic communities. ABM communities hard to reach. If you really want to reach them, you're able to find and you're able to reach them. My manager always says that if a BME commits a crime, the police will know how to reach them. The question should then be, is there interest in reaching these marginalized communities? SCOREscotland then applied for funding and has proved that Black and minority communities are not hard to reach. Yes, they are interested in climate change. And the reason why is because we are the most hit by the climate crisis, and will be the most affected. It is happening now, and its effects will continue to tremendously affect us more, whether directly or indirectly. When something is happening back home, I always say back home, and home I mean Uganda. When something is happening home, it indirectly affects me, even when I'm here in Scotland. So the effects, like I've said, the effects affect us here in the West, and also for those who live back in their home countries. And these effects do affect most people, include lack of green space, poor housing, education, especially now with homeschooling. Parents are expected to teach their children with limited tech know-how, limited English, etc. So figure it out. And the people, the marginalized communities will be the most hit in the education system, especially now. Because as a parent, if you do not know how to read English, if you're still learning how to read English, and then you're being told you need to teach your children at home without even considering that you actually don't even have, maybe you have 3 children, you have a phone, and maybe it's not a smartphone. The 3 children cannot use the phone that you have to access the education materials that the schools do send to the children. And the deprived communities are the ones that actually are most affected by poor air quality. And yet, maybe they don't even own a car. And the roads are not good enough, some of them, for poor communities to actually ride their bike. So air pollution is a big issue which affects the marginalized communities. Globally, it's people in poor countries who fall and continue to be victims of extreme weather damage caused by the climate crisis, although they have contributed least to these problems. Despite all these, our communities engage and continue to work together in reducing food waste, textile waste reduction, and try as much as possible to travel less, as well as take efforts to reduce their energy usage in the poor housing conditions that they live in. Have we all been knowing much about climate change? No. Have we known its effects and have we been affected? Yes. Our education hasn't prepared many, including myself, to adapt to the current climate crisis. And my parents who live in the rural part of Uganda will not be able to explain to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren why the soils no longer produce enough food and why the rains do not come as they used to. I have had to learn the basics of climate change, and I still continue to learn. Thinking about colonialism, I agree with a blog by Adeniyi Asiambi, who blogged on the 7th of August, 2019. He wrote, colonialism was a thoroughly environmental project, and that environment remains dangerously colonial today at a time of significant environmental crises. He continued to say, the environment in the colonial era was a site of struggle, over-racialized representation, exploitation, exclusion, and control. The legacies of this colonial history persist in the ways the environment is represented, lived in, researched, managed, and protected today. I therefore think that colonization of education should be centered around empowering those who have been and will be most affected by the climate crisis. questions must be asked. Anti-racist approaches must be used to educate about climate justice, to ensure diversity and inclusion are at the forefront of every action that we all take. Racism stops people from living the lives that they deserve, and no human being should have to fight all their lives to attain and reach their full potential. At SCOREscotland, we are committed to social justice and equal opportunities for all by providing a service that is accessible and inclusive. Taking a partnership approach, and I really appreciate the fact we have been engaged and involved in this, running these events. And we support and empower those who are disadvantaged and discriminated against. We recognize that a united community is the backbone of a cohesive and harmonious society, and thus we strive to put this unity back into the community. We support a participatory approach for our communities to be able to do what they really can and are able to take forward. This is the approach we encourage every organization, institutions, etc., to take to solve the problem of the climate crisis problem. It is a problem, everyone's problem, and we should all together take it seriously. I would like to echo what Yvette Williams said this morning. The truth only must be told. We should connect the history and look at what has happened. We should not leave history behind. We should look at what has happened and connect it together, and then be able to work towards what we would like to see. We should acknowledge that it won't be easy, but we must aim to work together and admit our failures when we don't get it right. Be willing to learn, unlearn, and relearn. We should fall forward, strive to strengthen what we know works, and learn what hasn't worked. I hope that gives you a perspective of where we have come from as SCOREscotland and where our passion, where my passion comes in. Thank you.
Thank you, Jolly. That was absolutely fantastic. And now I think we do have Fope back, so I'd like to invite Fope to come back in, and maybe you want to start from the beginning, because that must have been quite frustrating for you. And it was definitely frustrating for us who were ready and hanging on your every word, and then we lost you.
So sorry. Like I said, Zoom sometimes just hates me and sometimes it loves me. I don't remember what I was saying. I think I was talking about the framing of language being very important, but also being very deliberate. It's really interesting that global warming was the tool which sounded less scary. And so you're like the inherent violence and what's been done to the world. And more distinctly, like what's been done to the world by a very select privileged few, those with power, those with land, in the pursuit of like land, capitalism, not capitalism, capital, and the people who will face the repercussions of this, will face the brunt of it, and who are currently and have been for the last 500 years, are often people of color, people, working class people of color. And this is what I'll talk about the gender nature is, mostly women. And I think these type of like distinctions, we don't necessarily see that in mainstream representations of like climate change. I think when we look at like Extinction Rebellion, who I use as a case study in a workshop I do, you see a real big disconnect in like who are the victims and survivors of actual climate injustice and who are the faces of it. What are mainstream campaigns focusing on, and what are like activists focus on, like Black and brown activists. And I think it's really interesting when you push it further that, you know, NGOs who focus on austerity and poverty, they don't make that link between austerity, poverty, people who are living in low income housing, people who are more likely to live in polluted streets. This is completely linked to climate injustice. And going back to what Deborah said about solutions as electric cars, who can afford electric cars? Who will be who can afford to survive, which is the question that's been asked here. And I think it's really interesting. And I'm Nigerian, so I care a lot about the history. of Nigeria and Africa, specifically the Niger Delta. And I think when you look through the history specifically of Shao in the Niger Delta, it isn't just these are people who have ruined the land. They have killed and murdered and pillaged a country for these resources. And now Shao and BP and other big players in the oil industry get to do adverts where we're like, we care about the planet. We're investing in solar panels. We're investing in, families. And I think this disconnect is so amusing, but also, again, it's obscuring the inherent violence is what's being done, and what's being done from like bauxite mining in India to copper mine in Zambia to the oil spills and fracking disasters, and putting on a really pretty bow on it that if we just all believe and use plastic and like get rid of plastic straws and use metal straws, we'll be able to get by. When obviously the real answer here is, okay, why do these companies still exist, and why are they able to destroy livelihoods, destroy lands, and destroy cultures and the way people have lived for the last 500 years with no repercussions, with no punitive understanding of, okay, this is wrong. And I think it's really interesting. And the last thing I'll say before we'll go into the next person, because I don't want to say it for now, even the framing we have around of like the 12 degrees, I think it's really interesting because that still relies on like low-lying island states still being drowned, right? So in order for like us in the West to be saved, it still relies on countries in the rest of the world still being drowned, still being burned, people dying in their homes. And so the last thing I would say, and I think is a really important question when we look at like what are the repercussions of intersecting these narratives, is what is the cost, right? And what is the cost to people here? Not just like white people, but what is the cost to people in Britain, people in America? What do we need to give up? And I think that's a really hard question for people to answer, because why would you want to give anything up? And reframing that I think is really useful. I'm going to stop there and pass it on to the next speaker. Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Fope, and I'm so sorry you're having these difficulties with your connection. I'm so glad that we had you back to be able to hear what you had to say there. So the last person that we're going to hear from on our panel is Calum. So hopefully Calum's here, and I'll invite you now to speak.
Okay, right. Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Yep, brilliant. Okay. It's been really fascinating actually to listen to the three previous speakers. It's, the breadth of knowledge and different perspectives has been quite humbling. So I'm just a science teacher, really. So I've been teaching about climate change, basically from a scientific viewpoint. So teaching about processes, physical chemical processes, and then the effects of climate change. And I suppose back when I started teaching, that was really what we needed, because there was an awful lot of climate denial around. People denied that man-made climate change was happening, or that climate was actually changing, and that story needed to be told and understood. So I think we've got to a stage now where very few people are denying that climate is changing, and what can we do about it? So we in schools we teach about what we can do about it. So we talk about solar power and wind turbines and energy efficiency and cutting down travel and so on. But what I feel, personally, and I'm sure it's widespread, is that as a science teacher, we haven't really addressed fairness. And fairness, I think, in terms of the anti-racist theme of today's discussion, as a scientist, I'm looking at fairness, fairness across generations, fairness across nations. And I think as a scientist, the approach to take really is to look at the numbers and to kind of use our scientific approaches in order to view that issue through the lens that we view the world through. So we kind of generally make measurements and draw conclusions and so on. And so yeah, fundamentally, what I suppose the aim of that is to get across to young people that you need fairness between geographical nations, basically rich nations and poor nations. Rich nations have caused most of the problems and poor nations suffer first. And fairness between generations. So basically rich older people have all the power and poor younger people have been expected to solve the problems, and they don't have the power to do that at this moment. So in terms of my own subject, I said I'd be talking about the numbers. So using data, there's lots of data out there. So it's basically choosing some data so they can practice their numeracy skills and linking that to their judgment of what's right and what's wrong. So you could look at which areas have contributed CO2 over time, and then which areas are suffering from the biggest temperature changes or the biggest sea level, the biggest change in local weather patterns, and get pupils to look at correlations between these things and to draw conclusions based on hard facts. Also looking at other stuff that's in the news like refugee movements and so on, and looking for where are these refugee movements coming from and what's happening there in terms of climate and what are the reasons. It's not just people want to come here and live off our welfare state, there are other reasons behind that. In terms of challenges, so as a scientist, I'm really talking more about from the viewpoint of being a science teacher. I know there are other subject areas in schools where this would lend itself to a different approach, but definitely like modern studies or even English or subjects like that would take a different slant. So one thing is to get that conversation moving. So I'll talk about it in a second. So as a scientist, we tend to look at scientific processes, and we tend not to really link in with how does that fit into the wider world. And I see this as an opportunity to do that. So, scientists often understand climate change, they understand what should be done, but that they don't really translate that to their own lives or to what their country should be doing. It's almost like a third party type issue. They should do this or they should do that. And I think that then leads to people looking at how a country like the UK can make a relatively small change that can have a big impact. Whereas a country like, say, Thailand, which has a similar population, to have the same impact would have to take a massive change in people's lives and livelihoods. So that's another aspect where fairness comes to the fore. In terms of moving towards this kind of approach, there's one of the problems is, I suppose, the pandemic is still kind of raging, and that's led to a real narrowing of what people do. They're just trying to get their heads above water, and so introducing change right now is a difficult thing to do. So I think that change is probably best to come from the bottom up. So having practitioners who are keen and focused and doing amazing things and spreading the word that way would work better than having some sort of top-down approach from, say, Education Scotland telling us what we should be teaching. Sources of data and ideas for different analyses, I think, again, having people blazing a trail and then sharing that is probably the way to do that rather than trying a top-down approach. In terms of benefits, I see massive possibilities here in terms of linking between, say, science and maths and so on, where we tend to think of ourselves as like hard and logical and, I don't know, detached, and linking with subjects like social subjects and geography, where we tend to think of them as a science teacher as a bit wishy-washy. And I think there's a real possibility for working closely with these people because they have their specialism is all the stuff that ours is not, and our specialism is all the stuff that theirs is not. So in terms of working together in an interdisciplinary kind of way, you've got the potential for a really solidly rooted project that is dealing with the most important issue facing the world today, and dealing with it in such a way that people understand that we have to be fair and take account of different locations around the world, and our kind of outsized contributions to the problem require kind of outsized contribution to solving the problem as well. And I think that's me.
Okay, thank you so much, Callum. So what I'm just going to do now is hand over to Radhika, and Radhika is going to field questions.
Great.
And,
Thanks, Callum. Really excited to jump in here. I've been listening attentively to what each of you have been saying, Deborah, Jolly, Fope, and Callum, and also kind of paying attention to what's going on in the chat as you were speaking. And I thought there were some great ideas there, and sort of observations on the importance of having an intersectional approach. I don't think any of you really use that term, but I was thinking about the connections that you were making and inviting us to think about in terms of capitalism and patriarchy, capital and patriarchy, gender, and how actually gender patriarchy intersects with questions of race and colonialism, and how important it is to think about these in the context of climate justice and climate change education. And also the choice of terms we use, the language we use is so important. And each of you reflected on some of the challenges that you face. So in terms of the language one uses, in terms of how to speak with policymakers. And I was wondering if, or how to do this in classroom context. And I was wondering actually if I could ask each of you to say something about how you actually operationalize decolonizing in your respective context. So, and I'm thinking, Deborah, you started off by talking about Mara storytelling and the importance of storytelling as a method. And I was thinking that that's actually really quite an important insight in terms of how we can decolonize knowledge production, but also how we can decolonize pedagogies, our teaching practice, and how we might think about how that informs policy conversations. So I wondered if each of you could speak to that a little bit in terms of how you do that in your own work and through your own work. Thanks.
I'll go first. So what we have learned in doing our work, we don't tell our communities what to do. So we do not say, do this. We work collaboratively. We employ a participatory approach. Now, one of the things that we did when we started delivering the project that I'm working on was in terms of energy usage reduction. So supporting our communities to reduce their energy usage. Climate change is a new term to most of our community members, and telling them to reduce their energy usage. We had to we didn't want to tell them actually. So we worked with them to identify how actually they can be able to save on their energy bills, as an example. So do you want to save on your energy bills? And of course, everybody wants to save money. Everybody wants to save on their energy bills. Their energy bills are high, especially for community members who live in poor housing conditions. So by them learning how to save on their energy bill, actually they are reducing their carbon emissions. They are reducing how much energy they are using, but they are benefiting. So what is in it for them? What is in for their lives? How is that going to benefit them? So for us at SCOREscotland, we work with our communities to identify the areas of benefit for our communities. And then we are able to support them to make the changes that they would like to make. We don't say, do this, this is what you must do. We do deliver a community fridge. A community fridge is a community fridge, as it says, free food for everybody. And so we collect food that businesses would have thrown away, not even given to our community members, bring it in our community food fridge, and we say, come and help yourself. And by doing that, you're actually reducing food waste. If this food ends into our environment, then it will. So we don't come with the approach of do this. we don't tell our communities what to do. We work with them and support them to identify areas and ways of how they're able to improve their lives, but also make a contribution.
Thanks, Charlie.
I like that. I like that approach. I'll just share a couple of things that I do in teaching, because I do have to evaluate people eventually, is to get them to understand, like sort of what Fope was talking about, like for them to recognize that who we have to put all our supposed trust in has a monopoly on what the truth is. For them to understand there's limits to that kind of knowing. Is that it doesn't matter what class I'm teaching, I make them kind of go outside and sort of understand the limits to what they can know. For Indigenous peoples, it's more than the 5 senses. Because to me, it's important so that they can kind of see for themselves, experience for themselves what the limits are of what is known, so that hopefully they question, you know, they ask the right questions kind of thing. So that's one thing. One thing that I do, try to get students to think about their responsibilities, not just learning it as content and learning it as abstract, but going, all right, now what's your responsibility to this? What's your responsibility to justice? And how are you going to act on it? It's an actual assignment. They have to, they literally have to tell me that. And makes them very nervous, but I tell them this in advance. Either you're in the class, if you don't want to do this, then, you know, there's other classes that don't make you act on your knowledge, right? And the other thing I do is I do work, I call it story work. It's like a thing in Canada developed by Professor Joanne Archibald, an Indigenous scholar out of BC. And so it doesn't matter, like I'll even do it if I'm presenting to policymakers or academics, because I want them to respect our stories and what they tell us. And believe it or not, because we also deliver these workshops in the high school system, the secondary school system, the younger kids are better at it. They know how to draw out the knowledge and lessons from the stories more so than PhDs. Like because they're like, they still have that creative, they kind of still get it. And it's a lot more work to do it with people we've kind of educated people's creativity out of them, unfortunately. So it's actually easier to do it with the younger kids. So those are just a couple strategies that I use. And you know, I can do that because I'm the instructor, and students kind of want to do well in the class. So they'll try to do what I'm asking them to do. So I do kind of have that advantage, I guess you could say. So those are just some things that I do that help me get people to think in, like, not only think, but be in different kind of ways and understand things like in a more embodied kind of way in the short period of time I ever have with students, 12 to 13 weeks or something like that. But super keen to hear from others. So thank you for that opportunity.
Please, Fope.
I want to echo what Jolly and Deborah have said about stories and what you were saying. So when you look at the history of community organizing, specifically in Mississippi, like in 7 states, a lot of what that like rich tradition of community organizing is based on is this idea of the story. And Ella Baker, who's like essentially the mother of this community organizing, she really pushes the idea of like finding like ordinary people and telling their stories. And that's something that I've really tried to impart in my work. And I like to ask questions when I do facilitations. And the same thing happens with me when I work with younger people. It's a lot easier to get them to answer like, what's your stake in this? And like speak from the I, which basically means like only to talk about yourself and your like role in this big story we're telling. Whereas when I work with older people, it's very hard for them to move from this like framework of talking about people, right? And I'm always like, no, where are you in this story? Like, speak from the I don't really care about this community you organized with. I want to know what is your ideas here? What does this make you feel? What are your emotional ties to the stories we're creating? And I think it's really like a really good way of doing this type of work. And to go back to the community organizing I was talking about, I've been reading I've Got the Light of Freedom, which talks about the Mississippi tradition. And there's a bit that I just underlined yesterday, and it's about we found the ordinary people who were doing the work, and then we supported them. It wasn't about the generalities, it was about the individuals. So I think finding people who are doing the work and have been doing the work and uplifting and sharing those stories, or just passing them up to them so they can tell their own stories, is really useful here. Because I think too many people want to reinvent the wheel, often because they don't know what's come before them. But I think really making it so distinctly clear that there is a whole wealth a tradition of like climate justice organizing and stories and people like, you know, people who are heirs to a tradition of fighting against it, who people don't know about. And so that's something I really want to do more and unearth more of, because I think people respond so well to stories because it really speaks to them at the heart, I think. So yeah, that's just my own perspective there.
Thanks, Fope.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with the chat about stories being really powerful for getting information across, because you know, people switch off pretty quickly unless they've got something to hang information on. So, you know, as a teacher, I know that if you have a story to tell about some concept, you know, who discovered it or how they discovered it, then you've got, it's much more powerful as a lesson. Thinking about decolonizing education, I think we have a long way to go in terms of school education. You know, just think about science, because that's my area of expertise. You know, it's a story of white men over the centuries discovering things, and you know, I know that that's not the reality, but that's the way so many of the books are written. You know, the history of science is the history of Western science, and there's a real challenge there to kind of change that, and it's not going to be quick, but we are blessed in many ways with, you know, in my own school we have an awful lot of people from lots of different backgrounds, and they bring their own stories, they bring their own perspectives, and they bring their own languages. And that helps to open people up to the possibility of there being some different realities and some different takes on things that were understood. So I think we've got something to go with there. Just thinking about my own kind of background and colonialism as well. My parents were Gaelic speakers, and then I grew up with no Gaelic, because Gaelic is basically a language that's been repressed and mocked really over generations in Scotland. And so the Gaelic community in Scotland has kind of it's had a taste of what other communities in other countries abroad, what we've done as a nation across the world, we've also done to minority cultures in our own islands. And it's quite interesting to reflect on that. Final thing, my school is James Gillespie's high school, and James Gillespie was a kind of magnet in textiles and so on back in the 16th or 17th century. And actually there's a movement now to rename the school. And what's interesting is that that's been taken really seriously, and I haven't heard lots of shock horror, we can't do that, it's traditional, It's people are actually a lot more open to that kind of thing now than they used to be. So that's encouraging.
Thanks, Calum. That's actually also sort of reassuring for me. So I'm a young parent with a child in primary school in James Gillespie. So it's good to know that there are teachers like you there thinking about these important questions. There's some really interesting stuff going on in the chat about. There are no questions, but there's a really interesting conversation going on in the chat about creating spaces of uncertainty in classrooms. And if I could just pick up on that a little bit and ask you, so yes, storytelling, yes, sort of opening up, sort of creating spaces for questions to be posed, for reflexivity, but also when we, and a lot of the times in the kind of classrooms that I'm teaching in, but also in the classroom that my 5-year-old is in school, so whether at the university or in the school, we are now dealing with a diverse set of, you know, the children come from diverse contexts and backgrounds. So there will be some who will be privileged and some who will not be privileged. Some who are in the majority and others who are an ethnic minority in that context. So how to kind of, I'm thinking of Bell Hooks's sort of advice to us in terms of thinking about classrooms and creating classrooms where there is scope for questioning, but also learning is a process which can be painful, and sort of opening ourselves to a certain level of discomfort. So how do you do that when it comes to the issue of when getting your, you know, whether they are students or whether you're working in the community, to getting them to think about this reflexively when it comes to climate change and climate justice, because they're not all coming from the same positionality. They don't have the same embodied intersectionality in terms of race, class, gender, age, ability, and so on. If you see what I'm saying.
I'll just briefly tackle that, but keen to again hear from others is actually what I embed in the assignments. Unfortunately, I do teach a course that has an experiential learning component to it. And I actually ask them exactly that. Like that's actually the assignment I have to virtually stick online sometime this weekend, their feedback, where they actually have to know their own positionality. And I always start each course with land acknowledgement. It's kind of a thing in Canada where you talk about whose Indigenous territory that you're on so they can kind of understand how they benefit from colonialism and ongoing colonialism. So they kind of have to get that. And then they critique it because there's some critique of it because it's become this performative thing, right? Checkbox, we have to do this land acknowledgement. Now we can get to the real business of the day. And then I get them to write it. And then they have to reflect on how comfortable was that for you? And I read people's assignments, they're like pretty uncomfortable. But it's getting them to be okay with that. That there's like, cause I'm pretty well uncomfortable almost in all the spaces I'm in, you know, and I kind of still have to do my work and advance what I feel I need to do in terms of my responsibilities. So they kind of need to know that's what it's like for other people in the room and how can you kind of create a safe place for that. So exactly what you said is exactly what I make them do. And it's hard for them. They don't know how to do it, but it gets them to kind of think more deeply than what do I need to do to tell, well, what do I need to write to please the teacher? I'm not interested in that. I actually want to know what you think. There isn't necessarily a right answer to this. So yeah, so that's sort of one of the strategies that I do. Like literally I get them to do that and they tell me how comfortable or uncomfortable they are with that process.
Thanks, Deborah. Did anybody else want to jump in here? Otherwise, I think, yeah.
I'll go next if you want. I think the pandemic has been very interesting actually for me as a teacher who's been, you know, I didn't go to teaching to administer exams and, you know, and yet that is essentially a lot of what the job has become. And last year having the exams just abandoned and using teacher grades and so on, I thought, that's brilliant. And this year it's going to be similar. And you kind of think, well, how important is all that measuring and stuff? It has the effect of skewing what happens in the classroom, where you're basically taking these vessels and filling them up with knowledge so that they can then reproduce in a wholly artificial way, you know, in a way that they don't have to do in real life beyond school. So I think we have opportunities in terms of challenging this going forward, because you know that there has been a motion passed in the Scottish Parliament about the SQA and Education Scotland basically seeking reform, and I think we definitely need reform so that we have more time, more space for this kind of exploration, because this is true education where you're taking what's inside the person, finding out what's inside and then changing that, rather than passing stuff into their brains and expecting it to be the end of the story.
Thanks, Calum. That's yeah. Callum McGregor is sort of giving me the sign to say, let me know when to close. Yes. So that was actually, those were really great observations, Callum and Deborah. And actually, I can quite relate to what you were saying, Deborah, because I do some of this stuff in my own classrooms, and I don't teach on climate justice per se, but I do teach on intersectionality and feminist knowledge production. So again, very sort of similar reflections there. I know that Callum McGregor had a question on policy making and whether sort of the approach is very much problem solving there when it comes to issues of climate change. But I'm afraid we are out of time here. So I'm going to pass the mic back to Callum. But I hope that these conversations and if there are more questions, please do type them in the chat window and we'll kind of relay them to our speakers, and hope that these conversations continue beyond this panel discussion here, and that we've got lots of stuff to think about. So thank you very much, and over to Calum.
Okay, thank you, Radhika. I'll be brief because I know it's been a long day for everybody, but very, very stimulating. So I would just want to wrap things up just by obviously thanking each of our 4 panelists for giving up time on a precious Saturday to participate on the panel. And each of the panelists has offered rich insights into how and why we might use decolonial and anti-racist approaches in climate education. And I'm sure that these insights will nourish further dialogue as we consider how these questions inform education in our own context in Scotland. So there's lots, I guess, that I could say, but I'll just be really brief. Obviously, one of the things that shines through for me from this conversation, and especially at the end there, is the importance of positionality. Another thing that shined through for me was this broad view of education as life-wide, lifelong, and obviously not just learning in schools, but in communities, and also importantly through collective action too. And then the other thing really was the power and importance of storytelling. I mean, important for retelling and telling histories from below, and important for critiquing the status quo, and important for imagining alternative futures and contesting this perpetual sense that there's no alternative. And that's obviously not just this session, but that's been the whole day. I think several folk have commented on that. So that's been the community conversations, Mara, and right through to this panel. So I just want to say it's been so great to hear these different, but in some ways complementary perspectives, and as well as the astute questions that they've generated. And thank you. And I'll just hand back over now to our host, Zarina, to take us home, I think.